Millionaire throws out his beloved wife. 25 years later is shocked to see her with a young man identical to him. 25 years ago, Eduardo was an ambitious young man who had his whole life planned out. He came from a wealthy family where tradition and business were practically a religion. From an early age, he learned that, to maintain his family's power and status, he would need to make tough decisions, set aside his feelings, and above all, avoid anything that could compromise his image. It was in this cold and calculating environment that Eduardo met Mariana. She was everything he wasn't supposed to want. Sweet, simple, spontaneous. She came from a humble family, had no money or important connections, but possessed a zest for life that Eduardo had never experienced. With her, he felt free, as if the pressures of the world simply disappeared. The two fell deeply in love, and for a brief time, Eduardo believed that love could overcome any obstacle. But Eduardo's world wasn't that simple. He wasn't just a young man in love. He was the heir to an empire. His father, a cold and calculating man, constantly reminded him of the responsibilities that came with the family name. Eduardo, an heir doesn't let his heart lead. He thinks of the family, the legacy, the position we hold in this world. These words echoed in Eduardo's mind every time he was with Mariana, splitting his heart between the love he felt for her and the weight of his family's expectations. Over time, the pressure started to build. Rumors about his relationship with Mariana began to circulate among the company's most powerful members and high society. His family, worried about maintaining their image and fearing that the relationship could harm the business's reputation, started pressuring him to end the romance. "You'll lose everything, Eduardo. She's not the right woman for you. If you keep this up, you'll be giving up your position and your future," his parents said. Eduardo felt trapped, torn between love and the fear of losing everything he had built with his family. In a moment of desperation, he made the decision that would change his life forever. But he didn't just want to pull away from Mariana. He needed her to leave him, once and for all, so he could move forward without regrets. So on a cold, rainy night, he called her for a meeting, determined to end things for good. When she arrived, Eduardo looked at her with a mixture of pain and coldness, and with a voice trembling from repressed emotion, he told her a cruel lie. He said he knew she was cheating on him, that she was only interested in his money and his status, and that he had never meant anything to her. Every word cut into Mariana's heart, as she couldn't understand where these accusations were coming from. She tried to explain herself, but Eduardo remained firm, feeding the lie he had created to push her out of his life. With tears in her eyes and a broken heart, Mariana left, unable to understand the reason for his cruel words. After saying goodbye, Eduardo was left alone, feeling empty. He had achieved what his family wanted, pushing Mariana out of his life, but at what cost? He realized that in protecting his status, he had destroyed the only true love he'd ever had. Yet pride and family pressure kept him silent, and he moved on with his life, rising in the company and achieving everything his family had always wanted for him. The years went by, and Eduardo became a respected millionaire, feared by many, admired by others, but profoundly lonely. His financial successes never filled the void left by Mariana, and the lie he had told years ago still weighed heavily on his heart. Now, years later, Eduardo was at the peak of his career. He had reached a position of respect, solidified the family empire, and was known for his competence and coldness in business. But behind this facade of power was a quiet sadness, an emptiness he could never quite fill. Some nights, when he was alone, he would remember Mariana, that last night when he had falsely accused her, and the look of pain and disbelief on her face as she heard his words. Even with time, the guilt had never fully disappeared. One time, on a business trip to Florianopolis, Eduardo stayed at a luxury seaside hotel. It was a beautiful, quiet place, far from the hectic pace of his daily life. But that night, he had no plans to relax. The purpose of his trip was to close an important deal, and as always, his focus was on ensuring the success of the negotiation. After a long day of meetings, Eduardo decided to go down to the hotel lobby to clear his head. He grabbed a glass of wine from the bar and sat in one of the armchairs near the window, watching the ocean and letting the sound of the waves bring him a bit of peace. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost didn't notice the movement in the lobby. And then, in a brief glance, he saw her. Mariana. She was standing near the reception desk, talking to the clerk, and next to her was a young man, maybe in his 20s. Eduardo froze. Even after all this time, he recognized her instantly. Mariana looked different, but still radiated that same calm and simplicity he had once loved so much. She seemed happy, with a special glow in her eyes, as if life had given her something he had never truly experienced. And it was at that moment that Eduardo noticed the young man beside her. The young man was tall, with broad shoulders and a posture that reminded Eduardo a bit of himself when he was younger. But what caught his attention most was the young man's face. He was a younger version of Eduardo himself. The features, the determined gaze, the casual way he ran his hand through his hair while waiting for Mariana to finish her conversation. Eduardo felt his heart race. Could it be, he thought, trying to control the avalanche of emotions overtaking him? Unaware of Eduardo's intense gaze, the young man laughed at something Mariana said and held her hand affectionately, showing how close they were. Eduardo felt a mix of emotions: surprise, confusion, a hint of jealousy, and above all, a deep pain. A pain born from the possibility that this young man could be his son. Time seemed to stand still as he watched the two of them. Thousands of questions flooded his mind. Could he be his son? Had Mariana kept this secret for all these years? And if it were true, what could he do now? Driven by curiosity and the urge to uncover the truth, Eduardo stood up and walked toward them, unsure of what to say or how to act. As he got close enough, Mariana looked up and their eyes met. She recognized him immediately, and for a moment, her eyes sparkled with surprise. And something else, perhaps resentment or pain, a wound that time hadn't healed. Eduardo felt the impact of her gaze like a punch in the stomach. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. "Eduardo?" she asked, as if she still doubted that he was really there, so close to her again after so many years. He nodded, trying to keep calm. "Maria, it's you." His voice was low, almost a whisper. Eduardo looked at the young man beside her, who was watching him with a curious, slightly confused expression. Sensing the tension in the air, the young man turned to Mariana and asked, "Mom, is everything okay?" "Mom," Eduardo repeated, barely able to hide his emotions. The confirmation he had both dreaded and hoped for was right there, in a single word. Eduardo felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. It was as if the entire world around him had frozen, leaving only him, Mariana, and that young man whom he now suspected was his son. He tried to mask his surprise, but his heart was pounding, and his mind was racing with memories and regrets he had locked away in an emotional drawer he thought was forever sealed. The young man, still unaware of what was happening, looked back and forth between them with an expression of curiosity and maybe a bit of suspicion. Eduardo, in turn, studied every detail of the young man's face. The resemblance was undeniable. The same shape of the eyes, the same slightly crooked smile, the same way he raised his eyebrow when confused, something Eduardo knew he also did without realizing. Every feature reinforced what he already felt deep inside. This young man was, most likely, his son. Mariana, noticing the whirlwind of emotions in Eduardo's eyes, lowered her gaze and let out a deep sigh, as if bracing herself to confront a ghost from the past. She knew that sooner or later this moment might come. She knew that one day Eduardo might discover what she had kept hidden for so long, but she had never imagined it would be in such an unexpected encounter, in a place so far from home. Eduardo, trying to control the swirl of feelings inside him, took a step forward and, with a slightly shaky voice, asked, "What's your name, young man?" The young man, still a bit wary, looked at his mother before answering. "My name is Lucas," he said in a firm yet gentle tone. There was something in Lucas's gaze that radiated a quiet strength, a maturity Eduardo would never have expected to see in someone so young. "Lucas." Eduardo repeated the name, feeling as though each syllable carried an immense weight. Do you live here with your mom?" Lucas nodded, but it was clear he was still confused as to why this man, whom he had never seen before, seemed so affected by his presence. He looked at Mariana, seeking an explanation, and it was at that moment that Eduardo realized just how much he had truly lost. All these years, while he was building his empire, Mariana had been raising that young man alone, facing the hardships and joys of motherhood without anyone's help. And in that moment, Eduardo realized the true cost of his choices. It wasn't just the end of a romance. It was a life he had turned his back on, a son he had never known. Mariana, finally summoning the courage, lifted her gaze and said, with a voice steady but filled with sadness, "Lucas, this is Eduardo, an old friend." She hesitated over her choice of words, and Eduardo noticed the pain in her eyes. "Eduardo, this is my son, Lucas." The word "my" was said with a touch of possessiveness, as if Mariana wanted to make it clear that this young man was the result of a life she had built on her own, without him. Eduardo felt the sting, but he knew he deserved it. He had made choices in the past that had driven him away from Mariana, and now, from Lucas as well. He felt a wave of regret, mixed with a sense of helplessness. "Lucas, Eduardo began, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain to this young man, to his own son, the reasons he had abandoned his mother? How could he justify a lie that had shattered so many lives? Lucas, noticing his mother's discomfort and Eduardo's lost look, stepped forward, showing a courage Eduardo never would have expected. "Mr. Eduardo, my mother never talked much about the past, but she always made it clear that she overcame her challenges alone. So, if you don't mind, we'd like to continue our evening without interruptions," he said, with a firmness that even surprised Mariana. Eduardo was speechless. He didn't know what to say, and his chest hurt with a mixture of shame and regret. For the first time, he felt the weight of the choices he had made 25 years ago. As Eduardo drew closer to Mariana, his chest tightened. Even after all these years, he had never imagined that a simple reunion could stir up so many emotions. But now, seeing Mariana so close yet so distant, all he could feel was the consequence of his own decisions. He stood there, face to face with her, with the woman he had once loved deeply and whom, for one reason or another, he had left behind. He tried to stay calm, searching for the right words to start a conversation that might make sense, that might perhaps open a path to reconciliation. But before he could say anything, Mariana looked him directly in the eyes, and Eduardo noticed something that left him shaken. Her gaze no longer held any trace of affection. There was a certain weariness, a silent pain that only time and the struggle to protect her son could have caused. And alongside that pain, a coldness that seemed like a shield. Mariana sighed, and he realized that, unlike him, she was completely in control. "Eduardo," she began, her voice calm and steady but with a hint of bitterness, "I'm not sure what you expect to find by coming to me after all this time." Her words were sharp, cutting. "But maybe you've forgotten that 25 years ago, you made your choice." Eduardo felt the blow. Her words hit him hard. He lowered his gaze, unable to bear the weight of that truth. He knew he had made his choice. He knew that, out of fear of losing the prestige, position, and security his family offered him, he had chosen the easier path, to leave Mariana and walk away from anything that might tarnish his reputation. To protect his own image, he had lied, twisting the truth to make her appear at fault. "Mariana, he tried to interject, but Mariana raised her hand, signaling that she didn't want to hear it. She wasn't there to listen to excuses, much less to receive justifications that wouldn't change any of what she had endured alone. "I don't need you to explain anything, Eduardo," she continued. "Not after everything I went through to protect my son and make sure he had a good life. He didn't need to know what happened. and I made sure to keep the past away from him. Because, for me, the only thing that mattered was that he grew up without needing you. There was a wounded pride in her voice, mixed with the conviction of someone who knew she had made the right choice, even in the face of so many challenges. Eduardo felt Mariana's words like a slap. He looked at her and realized, perhaps for the first time, just how strong she really was. Raising Lucas on her own, without ever reaching out to him, without ever trying to bring him back or asking for anything. He began to understand that by pushing her away, he had forced her to become this independent and resolute woman who no longer had any room for him in her life. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry," Eduardo murmured, his voice broken. He knew those words wouldn't be enough, that they wouldn't erase the years of silence and the pain he had caused, but it was all he had. Mariana looked at him for a moment, and for a brief second he almost saw a trace of emotion in her eyes, as if she were somehow reliving that painful past. But soon her expression closed off again. She gave a small smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was a smile of someone who had overcome the pain and no longer needed to revisit it. "Eduardo, you made your choice, and I made mine," she said, in a tone that was both a farewell and a declaration that the past was truly buried. "I chose to raise my son alone. I chose to protect him from all of this." Eduardo remained silent, watching her walk away. It was a cold, gray afternoon, one of those that seemed to reflect the weight of emotions. Eduardo stood in front of Raphael's small house, feeling his heart race and his hands tremble slightly. He knew this moment was crucial, but fear and uncertainty clouded his thoughts. It had been years since he'd last seen the young man, and now, somehow, he needed to build a bridge over the chasm of time and the mistakes of the past. Eduardo adjusted his coat collar, took a deep breath, and rang the doorbell. The next moment he heard firm, hurried footsteps on the other side of the door. It was him, Raphael, the young man he believed to be his son. The door opened slowly, revealing a young man with a hard stare and a cold expression. Raphael looked at him with suspicion, and an uncomfortable silence settled between them. "Hi, Raphael," Eduardo said, attempting a smile. "Can we talk?" Raphael crossed his arms, his eyes filled with hurt. He made an impatient gesture for Eduardo to come in, but the atmosphere didn't get any lighter. They sat in the small living room, and the young man avoided looking directly at him, as if he were building an invisible wall. Eduardo knew it wouldn't be easy, but he decided to press on. I don't know where to start," Eduardo said, nervously fidgeting with his hands. "I know I haven't been around for a long time, and maybe you feel like you have no reason to listen to me." Raphael let out a frustrated sigh, shaking his head as he interrupted. "Eduardo, you disappeared. Years and years without a word, not even a phone call. And now you show up, like a conversation can just change the past." Raphael's tone was harsh, full of bitterness. He wasn't willing to give Eduardo an inch. But Eduardo knew he had to keep going, even in the face of resistance. "I know it's easy to talk now, Raphael, and I know words don't erase mistakes," Eduardo replied, his voice strained with emotion. "But there's a story you may not know, something that might maybe help you understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just for you to listen." Raphael stared at him for a few seconds, as if deciding whether it was worth hearing the story. Finally, he leaned back on the couch, arms still crossed, and murmured, "5 minutes. Just 5. Eduardo sighed, grateful for the small concession. He began to speak, trying not to look away from Raphael, so the young man could see the sincerity in his eyes. "When I was young, Raphael, things weren't easy. I was irresponsible, thought the world revolved around me. I didn't think about the consequences of my actions. When I found out about you, I panicked. I was immature, not ready to be a father, and instead of facing my fears, I ran away." He paused for a moment, watching for a reaction, but Raphael's face remained serious, unmoved. "I know that excuse doesn't change anything," Eduardo continued, "but with each passing day, the guilt only grew, and time went by so fast. When I finally realized you were already grown with a life of your own, and it seemed too late. But I knew I had to try. Even if you hate me, I needed to tell you this. Raphael, who had been listening in silence, slowly uncrossed his arms. His eyes showed a mix of resentment and slight curiosity, as if he were trying to process what he was hearing. "So, why now, Eduardo?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Why do you expect me to believe you after all this?" Eduardo lowered his head, struggling to contain his emotions. "Because what haunts me every day is the thought of doing nothing to make things right. Even though I know I can't undo what I did, I want you to know I never stopped thinking about you. And if you could give me a chance, however small, I'll be here to prove I've changed." The silence stretched between them, heavy with complex emotions and unspoken words. Raphael took a deep breath. His eyes still showed pain, but there was also a glimmer of reflection. He didn't give a definitive answer at that moment, but something deep in his heart began to wonder. Maybe, just maybe, Eduardo deserved more than an abrupt farewell. Eduardo sat in a wooden chair, his hands sweaty and his heart heavy. In front of him, Mariana watched him with a restrained expression of pain, like someone who had suffered so much that she had almost gotten used to avoiding hope. She had always been strong, always found ways to keep moving forward. But this conversation, perhaps this was the one that hurt the most, the one that brought back memories too difficult to face. Eduardo looked away for a moment, as if he needed strength to say what he buried deep inside. He knew this moment would come, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. "Mariana," he began, his voice rough. "I know it took me far too long to say this, and maybe it's too late, but I need you to know what happened. I need you to understand why I pushed you away." Mariana didn't respond immediately. She stayed still, trying to figure out if there was anything true left in the words of this man. Eduardo took a deep breath and, slowly, ran his hands over his face, as if trying to lift an invisible weight. Finally, he started to speak, a bit more firmly. "Back then, everything seemed more complicated than it really was. My family, well, they had expectations, pressures, and I let it all crush me. I was young, insecure, and before I knew it, I was following their wishes as if I had no choice. They thought I should stay away from you, that our love wasn't right." Mariana felt a tightness in her chest. It wasn't exactly a surprise, but hearing him say those words brought back the pain of a time when she didn't understand why Eduardo had left her, leaving only emptiness and questions. Eduardo continued, his voice trembling but sincere, like someone who had spent a long time coming to terms with his own mistakes. I was weak, Mariana," he admitted, swallowing hard. "Instead of fighting for us, I gave in. I gave in to the pressure, to the threats that everything I knew could crumble if I stayed with you. And I believed it would be easier to walk away, to pretend our love didn't matter, than to stand up to my family." He paused, his eyes glistening, as if a tear was about to fall. "I was selfish and cowardly, and by the time I realized the mistake I had made, it was too late. I made an unforgivable mistake by leaving you, by pushing you away, and I know it's something I can never make right." Mariana watched him with a steady gaze, but the pain was there, visible on her face. She didn't need to say anything for Eduardo to understand the impact of his actions. "You left me behind like everything we had meant nothing," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "Like I was just a phase you could forget." Eduardo lowered his head, the weight of her words hitting him like a sentence. He knew he deserved this, that there weren't enough excuses to erase the pain he had caused. "Mariana, I know nothing I say can change what happened. I know you moved on, and I never deserved forgiveness for what I did. But what I wanted, what I needed, was to tell you this truth. I was weak, and because I was weak, I made the biggest mistake of my life." A silence settled between them. Mariana looked at the man in front of her, the man who was once her whole world and now seemed so distant, so lost. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive him, but that confession, painful as it was, felt like a step she had waited many years for. Eduardo looked at her with genuine regret. He didn't expect her to say she forgave him. He knew he didn't have that right. But in that moment, amidst the pain and hurt, he found a small bit of peace in finally having told the truth. Mariana took a deep breath and stood up. She didn't say anything else, but gave Eduardo one last look, a look that held a bit of everything: pain, disappointment, and, perhaps, a slight hint of understanding. Without a word, she walked away, leaving him alone with the weight of his own regret, now feeling even deeper, yet somehow clearer. In that instant, Eduardo understood that confessing his mistake wouldn't redeem him, but it brought forth a necessary truth, a small spark of honesty in a past full of lies. He knew he might never see Mariana again, but for a brief moment, he felt what it meant to be honest with himself and with the person he had loved most in his life. Eduardo sat on a wooden bench in the park, watching from a distance as Rafael and his mother played with the dog. He had chosen a spot a bit farther away, where no one would notice him, and there he stayed, watching his son run, carefree and laughing beside her. Rafael wasn't a child anymore, but there was still a youthful quality to his smile, a joy that Eduardo didn't know how it blossomed without him. As he watched, he felt a tightening in his chest, a guilt that seemed to grow heavier with every moment. Eduardo knew he had lost so much. He had never been there during Rafael's childhood laughter, his teenage years full of questions, or those nights when Rafael might have needed a father for advice. Instead, he had been an absence, an empty space. Rafael's mother, a woman with a warm smile and a certain firmness in her movements, looked at her son with a tenderness he could barely describe. The way she placed her hand on Rafael's shoulder, the way he told her something and she'd smile, tilting her head with all the attention in the world. Eduardo could see, with painful clarity, just how close they were, how strong and unbreakable that bond was. They shared a natural connection, built over years of togetherness, trust, and unconditional love. Eduardo lowered his head, feeling the weight of the years he had let slip by. How many opportunities had he missed? How many laughs and precious moments had he let escape? All because he had stayed away. He had never been there to comfort Rafael, to hold his hand through nightmares, or to teach him life's lessons. He hadn't been the father Rafael needed. And now, as he watched that scene, he realized the emptiness in his heart was far greater than he had imagined. The guilt was a constant presence, something he carried in silence, but now, in that moment, the pain felt 3 times as strong. Eduardo remembered the choices he had made, the excuses he'd given himself for not being present, and each one now felt hollow, meaningless. It was a mistake he knew he could never undo. If only, he murmured to himself, his voice catching. He desperately wanted to turn back time. He wished he had been someone better, someone strong enough to be there beside Rafael and his mother, to be part of their story. But the past was done, and all that remained was regret. Eduardo looked up and saw Rafael hugging his mother tightly before running off after the dog. In that embrace, Eduardo saw true love, the kind of love he had never known how to give but now realized meant everything. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, as Eduardo sat in a small cafe on the corner of the street. He took a sip of his bitter coffee, trying to warm the heart that was frozen with regret and sadness. The conversations around him felt distant, as if everything around him was clouding his mind. But then suddenly, something made him stop. He saw Rafael entering the cafe with a friend. The young man looked so different, so grown up, and Eduardo couldn't help but notice the way he moved, confident, laughing easily. Part of him swelled with pride, but another part was hit with a wave of pain. He felt he had no right to feel pride for Rafael, not after everything he had done. As Eduardo tried to find the courage to approach him, Rafael looked in his direction. The young man hesitated for a moment, and Eduardo felt his heart race. Rafael made a small, almost involuntary nod, a gesture that, for a brief moment, opened a little door into the world Eduardo thought was locked forever. Eduardo felt this was his chance. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked toward his son. The world seemed to move in slow motion, each step as heavy as if he were carrying the weight of the past. He drew closer, his gaze steady, but his heart was still full of insecurity. "Hi, Raphael," he said, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. "Mind if I join you?" Raphael looked at Eduardo, a mixture of surprise and doubt on his face. He glanced at his friend who, sensing the tension, gave a slight smile and moved aside, as if understanding this was a conversation that needed to happen. Eduardo sat down at the table, and a heavy silence fell between them, loaded with unspoken feelings. "I didn't know you'd be here." Raphael finally broke the silence, his voice cautious. Eduardo noticed a slight opening, a crack in the armor Raphael had built around himself. It was as if, for a brief moment, his son was willing to listen. "Yes, I'm just trying to find myself," Eduardo replied, feeling the need to be honest. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that happened. I don't want you to see me only as the man who left. I'm truly sorry for what I did." Raphael kept his gaze fixed on Eduardo, his expression a mix of disbelief and caution. "You don't understand," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "It was more than just leaving. I grew up without you. I always hoped that one day you'd show up, but you never did." Eduardo felt his heart tighten. He knew Raphael's words were only scratching the surface of a deeper pain, a pain he had caused by choosing not to be there. But in that moment, his son seemed a little more open, as if the defenses he had built over the years were starting to crumble. "I know I left you behind, and that's unforgivable," Eduardo replied, his voice low and full of sincerity. "But I'd like to have a second chance. I want to get to know you, to learn who you are now. I want to build something, even if it takes time. I want to make things right, Raphael." There was a vulnerability in Eduardo's words that seemed to resonate with Raphael. The young man looked at his father, and for a moment, Eduardo glimpsed the boy he could have raised. Raphael's eyes glimmered with a mix of anger and hope. "I don't know if I can just forget all of it. It's hard to believe you're really here now. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm willing to fight for this," Eduardo said, his eyes locked on Raphael's, silently pleading for a chance. "You deserve a father who's there for you. I want to be that father." Raphael seemed to hesitate, as if he were weighing Eduardo's words in his mind. There was a small gap between them, but Eduardo sensed that maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward reconciliation. Raphael lowered his eyes, thoughtful, and Eduardo waited, his heart racing as hope began to seep slowly into his soul. Finally, Raphael took a deep breath, lifting his gaze again. "If you really want to try, then we can talk more. But it's not going to be easy," he said, a small, hesitant but hopeful smile beginning to form on his face. It was a start, an opening, and Eduardo felt a wave of emotion as he realized there was, at least, a chance to reconnect the ties that had been severed. And so there, at that cafe table with the setting sun behind them, Eduardo and Raphael began to forge a new path, one full of uncertainties but also renewed hopes. It was a small step, but the first of many that might finally lead to the redemption Eduardo so desperately wanted. Eduardo sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and old photos that told the story of a past he now wished he could change. He looked at an image of Raphael, a young man full of life, and felt that the boy he had left behind still had the capacity to dream. But more than anything, Eduardo wanted Raphael to know that his father was back, ready to give his best. With a surge of determination, Eduardo decided it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try. The first step would be to earn Raphael's trust. He knew that trust had been shattered by years of absence, and that the task would require more than words. It would demand action, sincerity, and genuine commitment. The first thing Eduardo did was to find out what Raphael liked. He remembered a conversation he'd had with Raphael's mother, Mariana, about their son's passion for soccer. So, he decided that his first attempt to reconnect would be an invitation to a game at the stadium. Even though Eduardo wasn't a big fan of the sport, he prepared. He watched videos, read about team strategies, and even learned some of the chants the fans sang. When the day of the game arrived, Eduardo's heart was racing. He arrived at the stadium. The smell of popcorn and the sound of vibrant cheering in the background made his heart pulse with anticipation. He remembered how he had always dreamed of sharing moments like this with Rafael. As the father he should have been, the butterflies in his stomach turned into determination. He sent a message to Rafael, asking if he wanted to go to the game. To his surprise, Rafael accepted, albeit cautiously. On the day of the match, Eduardo was there, anxiously waiting at the entrance of the stadium. When he saw Rafael approaching, his heart raced. The young man looked hesitant, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "Hey, Dad," he greeted, his voice a little nervous but friendly. "Hey, Rafael, I'm so glad you came," Eduardo replied, trying to convey enthusiasm and sincerity. The feeling of being close to his son was indescribable. As they entered the stadium, the vibrant atmosphere began to envelop them, and Eduardo made sure to share every moment with Rafael, from choosing their seats to analyzing the plays. He worked hard to talk about everything happening in the game, trying to create a light and fun environment. However, with every laugh and conversation, Eduardo also felt like he was rebuilding himself. He needed Rafael to know that he wasn't just a man showing up out of the blue, but a father who wanted to be part of his life. The exciting plays and the cheers from the crowd helped break some of the ice between them, but Eduardo knew this was just the beginning. After the game, which ended in an exhilarating victory for the team, Eduardo mustered the courage to invite Rafael for a snack at a nearby diner. As they sat at the table, Eduardo realized it was the perfect moment to be honest about his feelings. He looked into Rafael's eyes and said, I know I'm far from being the father you deserved, and I understand that regaining your trust will take time. But I want you to know that I'm here now, and I want to make this right." Rafael stared at him, his expression a bit softer. "I don't know if I can trust you yet," he admitted, "but it was nice to have you by my side today." Eduardo felt a wave of hope, as if that small acknowledgement was a sign that they could begin to understand each other. Eduardo then thought of Mariana, Rafael's mother, and how important it was to regain her respect as well. He remembered how strong and caring she had always been, and how her words and actions in the past had caused deep wounds. He knew he needed to present himself to her, not as a man who had failed, but as a father willing to redeem himself and be a part of his son's life. Determined to face this challenge, Eduardo visited Mariana's house the next day. With his heart racing, he knocked on the door, and when she opened it, a mix of surprise and caution crossed her face. "Eduardo," she said a little hesitantly, "what are you doing here?" "Hi, Mariana. I wanted to talk to you," he began, his voice trembling. "I know I've made many mistakes in the past, and I can't change that. But I want you to know that I'm here to do my best for Rafael and for myself. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain your respect." Mariana looked into his eyes, weighing his words. She was visibly emotional but still skeptical. "Eduardo, it's not easy for me. You don't know what Rafael and I have been through without you," she replied, her voice strong but tinged with fragility. "I know, and I can't ask you to forgive me now, but I want to try. I'm determined to be a better father to Rafael and a better man for you. If you give me a chance, I promise I will do my best," Eduardo said, the sincerity in his voice resonating in the stillness of the moment. Mariana fell silent for a moment that felt like an eternity. Finally, she sighed and replied, "Let's see how you do. I don't promise anything, but I can give you a chance to show that you're really changing." With those words, Eduardo felt a new breath in his soul. It was the beginning of a long journey, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but also with hope and the promise of a future where he could be the father he had always wanted to be. With every small step, he was determined to build a new relationship with Rafael and to regain Mariana's trust. knowing that the journey wouldn't be easy but would be worth it. Mariana stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression firm and guarded. The gentle wind lightly tousled the strands of hair that escaped from her undone bun. Eduardo, standing before her, felt the weight of rejection with every passing second. He knew he had hurt the woman he still loved, and more importantly, that he needed to win back her trust. "Mariana," he began, his voice trembling but full of sincerity. "I know I'm not the person you expected to see again. I made huge mistakes in the past, and I know that can't be easily erased." The sunlight filtered through the leaves of the tree beside them, casting dancing shadows on the ground, as if the day itself was uncertain about how it should feel. Mariana watched Eduardo, her eyes evaluating every word and gesture. "Do you really think a sorry will fix everything you've broken?" "It's been years of pain and loneliness for me and Raphael," she replied, her voice steady. But there was an underlying vulnerability that did not escape Eduardo. He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "No, I don't expect a simple apology to fix everything. What I want is to show you that I'm different now, that I've changed. I've spent months thinking about everything I did and what I lost. All I want is the chance to be a father to Raphael and to be someone you can respect again." As he spoke, Eduardo remembered the nights he had stayed awake, reliving the mistakes he made. He remembered Mariana laughing, full of life, and how his absence had silenced that laughter. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I want to fight for it. I'm here, willing to do whatever it takes." Mariana let out a heavy sigh, the distrust still evident in her eyes. "You talk a lot, Eduardo, but I need actions. Raphael cannot be disappointed again. He's already been through so much because of you," she said, her voice as firm as a rock. There was a deep love in her words, but also a fierce protectiveness for her son. "I understand, and that's exactly why I'm here," he replied, determination growing within him. "I want to show Raphael that I'm a man he can trust. I want him to feel that he has a real father by his side, someone who doesn't just promise but delivers." Eduardo began to remember every moment when he had lost the chance to be a present father. Raphael's first words, the first steps he hadn't witnessed, the birthdays he hadn't celebrated. A deep sadness enveloped him, but he was determined to change that story. "Let me try. Let me take Raphael to practice sports or just to get ice cream. I want to get to know him and reconnect." Mariana watched him in silence, her gaze softening slightly. She still wasn't completely convinced, but there was a seed of hope sprouting in her heart. "I can't promise you that this will work, Eduardo. You'll have to prove that you deserve this chance," she finally said, her eyes fixed on his. "I will," he replied, feeling a temporary relief, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. He wanted to be a new person, but that would require time and patience. Eduardo was willing to take every necessary step, even if it meant facing Mariana's distrust and Raphael's hesitation. "And what about me?" Mariana asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I don't know if I can trust you again. You don't know how much this hurt me. What do you expect from me?" She was vulnerable, and Eduardo knew he had to be careful. "I just want you to give me a chance to show that I'm here to stay," Eduardo said, his voice softer. "I don't want you to have to trust me now, but I would like you to allow me to be part of Raphael's life, even if gradually. I want to earn your trust, your respect, and who knows, maybe one day the chance for us to be friends again." Mariana hesitated, the weight of his words pressing on her heart. She knew Eduardo, the man she once loved, and she was still battling memories of a past that felt distant yet so present. "Okay, Eduardo, let's try," she finally said, her expression firm but with a slight glimmer of hope in her eyes. "But I can't promise it will be easy." Eduardo felt warmth spreading through his chest, a mix of hope and gratitude. He was about to embark on a difficult journey, but he was determined to fight for a future where he could be part of Raphael's life and, perhaps, regain Mariana's love and friendship. He knew the road would be long, but each step was an opportunity to show who he truly was now, a man ready to repair what had been broken. Days were passing, and Eduardo felt that every second was a challenge. He had taken the first step, confronting the past and reconnecting with Mariana. But now, the real battle was to win over Rafael, his son, who was the key to the future Eduardo so desired. One morning, as the sun began to light up the blue sky, Eduardo received an unexpected message from Mariana. "Rafael is willing to meet you. He wants to know more about you," the message said. Eduardo's heart raced at these words. It was as if a bright light had flickered on amid the darkness that had surrounded his life for so long. Eduardo meticulously prepared for this meeting. He chose a t-shirt that his mother always had made him look like a good guy, and a pair of jeans that still carried the scent of fresh detergent. As he looked in the mirror, he felt that despite all his insecurities, he was finally becoming the man he had always wanted to be. He was determined to show Rafael that he wasn't just his biological father, but also someone who could be present and trustworthy. The place Mariana chose for the meeting was a small city park, a tranquil space filled with leafy trees and colorful flowers. It was the perfect setting for the first step in building a new relationship. Upon arriving, Eduardo took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. Each step toward the park seemed to lift a part of the weight he carried on his shoulders. He didn't know what to expect from Rafael, but there was a spark of hope ignited within him. When he reached the park, Eduardo spotted Mariana sitting on a bench, talking with Rafael, who was playing with a small dog he seemed to have found. Eduardo hesitated for a moment, observing the interaction between mother and son. The way Rafael laughed and played with the dog was infectious, and Eduardo couldn't help but feel a pang of pain realizing how long he had been absent from those precious moments. Finally, Mariana looked at Eduardo and nodded, signaling that it was time for him to approach. Eduardo's heart raced as he walked toward them, his mind filled with doubts. What if Rafael doesn't want to meet me? What if he rejects me again? However, those thoughts were quickly replaced by the renewed hope he felt. "Hi, Rafael," Eduardo said, trying to sound natural, even though the anxiety was almost palpable. The boy looked at him with a curious expression, a mix of surprise and distrust. Eduardo couldn't blame him. After all, he was a stranger in his life. "I'm your father. I'd like to spend some time with you, if you want." Rafael hesitated, looking at Mariana for confirmation. "She said you were changed, that you wanted to get to know us," he replied, his voice a little quieter, but there was a glimmer of interest in his eyes. Eduardo felt a wave of relief as he realized the boy was willing to open a door, even if it was just a crack. "Yes, I'm here for that," Eduardo said, his eyes meeting Rafael's. "I want to know more about you, about what you like, your favorite music, and I'd also like to share a little about myself." He smiled, trying to divert attention from the tension in the air. "I'm a big fan of superhero movies. What's your favorite?" Rafael seemed intrigued, and Eduardo noticed that although the road ahead would be long, there was a small opportunity for connection. "I like Spider-Man," Rafael replied, and Eduardo felt warmth swell in his chest. "He's cool and does amazing things." "I love Spider-Man too," Eduardo exclaimed, realizing he was taking the first step toward a dialogue that could pave the way for something bigger. "You know, I used to imagine myself as Spider-Man when I was younger. I always dreamed of being someone's hero, and now I want to be your hero, if you'll let me." Rafael looked at him, a mix of hope and hesitation in his eyes. But for Eduardo, this was a sign. The boy was willing to listen to him, to get to know him a little better. With every exchanged word, Eduardo felt his determination grow. After a few conversations, Mariana got up to grab some drinks, leaving Eduardo and Rafael alone for a moment. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it was a pause filled with anticipation. Eduardo was about to ask Rafael about his hobbies when the boy turned and said, "Do you really want to be my dad?" That question made Eduardo's heart race. It was a golden opportunity. "Yes, Rafael, I really do. I know I wasn't there before, but I want to change that. I want you to know you can count on me, no matter what happens." He waited, holding his breath, as Raphael pondered his words. A shy smile appeared on Raphael's face, and Eduardo realized that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to earn his son's trust. That small gesture ignited a spark of hope in his heart. Eduardo knew the journey ahead would still be long and full of challenges, but for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. The idea of becoming a present father and a better man no longer felt like a distant dream. Eduardo looked up at the blue sky above and made a silent promise to himself. He would not give up. With Raphael willing to get to know him better, Eduardo was more motivated than ever to continue his efforts at reconciliation. The future was still uncertain, but now there was a light on the horizon, and Eduardo was determined to walk toward it, step by step, alongside his son. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to not miss other exciting stories like this one on Universe in Words. Leave a like and share with friends who appreciate stories of twist and triumph. The next story will surely touch you too. Until then,